The ring was on her hand. Not mine. Hers. I stood at the edge of the bridal shower with a plate of lemon cake I never touched, looking at my stepsister's finger, and for 3 full seconds I told myself I was wrong. Then she turned her hand to catch the light, the way you do when you want a stone to be noticed, and the star inside the sapphire moved exactly the way it had moved 100 times before, under my grandmother's reading lamp, on my grandmother's hand. I knew that ring the way you know your own face in a mirror. I knew the small chip on the left shoulder of the setting, the one Grandma Astrid always said came from a church door frame in 1958. I knew the hallmark stamped on the inside of the band, 3 letters in a year, because I had photographed that hallmark myself with a loop and a steady hand 4 years earlier, for an insurance file that still sat in my desk drawer at work. My father told me, 11 months before that bridal shower, that the ring was gone. Lost, he said. Misplaced during the move out of Grandma's house. He said it standing in my kitchen with his hands in his jacket pockets, not quite looking at me. And I had believed him, because a daughter believes her father the way she believes gravity, without checking. But I am a certified gemologist. I spend my working life confirming whether things are what people claim they are. And gravity, it turns out, is the one thing in that family I should have kept checking. This is the story of what happened when I found the receipt my grandmother gave me 30 years before any of this began, and what that one piece of paper did to a family that thought a dead woman's jewelry was simply theirs to spend. My name is Nora Lindqvist. I'm 34. I'm a certified gemologist, the kind who gets called in when an insurance company wants to know if a stone is real before they pay out, or when a family needs to know what grandma's brooch is actually worth before they fight over it. I work out of a small appraisal office on Cobb Street in Asher Hollow, the kind of town where everyone's mailbox has a name you recognize. I have spent 12 years learning to read objects the way other people read faces. A scratch tells you a story. A setting tells you an era. A receipt tells you the truth, if you know how to ask it the right questions. I learned to love stones from my grandmother, Astrid Lindqvist, who ran a small jewelry counter inside Harwell's department store on Main for 30 years before she retired. She taught me to hold a loop steady at age 9. She taught me the difference between a flaw and a fingerprint, between something cheap that sparkles and something honest that simply holds light. She used to say a good stone never needs to perform. It just sits there, patient, telling the truth whether you're paying attention or not. She had 3 pieces she loved more than anything else she'd ever owned. A star sapphire ring my grandfather bought her in 1958, the year they married, set with a small chip on the left shoulder from the day she caught her hand on a church doorframe walking out of their own wedding. A strand of cultured pearls she wore to every Easter service for 60 years, and a gold filigree brooch shaped like a wren, which she wore pinned over her heart on the anniversary of my grandfather's death, every single year, until she couldn't pin it on by herself anymore. She told me when I was 26, sitting at her kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between us, that all 3 pieces were going to be mine. Not my father's, not divided. Mine. She said it plainly, the way she said most things, and then she got up, went to her bedroom closet, and came back with a small cedar box. Inside it, folded in tissue paper that had gone soft and yellow with age, was the original appraisal receipt from the jeweler who'd set the sapphire for my grandfather in 1958. A man named Otto Pruitt, of Pruitt and Hale Fine Jewelers, long since closed. The receipt listed the stone's weight, the gold purity, the hallmark he'd stamped inside the band, and a sale price of $41, which made my grandmother laugh every time she read it out loud. Keep this, she told me. People forget things. Paper doesn't. I had that receipt photographed, scanned, and filed before I left her house that afternoon. 4 years later, when she let me borrow the set for my own engagement photos, the engagement that never quite became a wedding, I had the whole collection independently appraised and insured under my own name as a professional courtesy to myself. New photographs, updated weights, the hallmark documented again under better light. I never imagined I'd need any of it. I kept it the way you keep a spare key, just in case. Grandma Astrid died 14 months ago, in February, in her sleep, in the house on Birch Lane she'd lived in for 50 years. She was 88. The funeral was small and quiet, the way she would have wanted it. My father, Gerald Lindqvist, gave the eulogy. He cried at the podium, real tears, and I believed every one of them, because I still believe a man can grieve his mother honestly and still do something unforgivable 8 months later. My father remarried 5 years before Grandma died, to a woman named Renata, after my own mother passed when I was 22. Renata came with a daughter from her first marriage, Paige, 3 years younger than me. Blonde and easy with people in a way I have never managed to be. I didn't resent Paige for being likable. I resented the way my father's house rearranged itself around her the moment she walked in. The way Grandma Astrid's house never quite did, no matter how many years passed. My father, Gerald, ran Lindqvist Auto on Route 9 for 31 years. A two-bay garage with a gravel lot and a bell on the door that rang the same way every time someone walked in. It was steady work, never flashy, the kind of business that pays the mortgage, and not much more. 2 years before Grandma died, a national chain opened a service center off the highway with 4 lifts and a waiting room that served free coffee. And Lindqvist Auto started bleeding customers the way small shops do when the world gets faster around them. My father didn't talk about it much. He never has been a man who talks about losing. But I saw the numbers once, helping him with a tax question the year before Grandma passed, and I knew the shop was carrying more debt than it was generating in income. I knew, too, that he'd taken out a small loan against the building to cover payroll the previous winter. He never asked me for help. I think some part of him would rather have gone under quietly than admit to his daughter that the ground under him was shifting. Renata, for her part, had grown up with very little and had spent the better part of her adult life making sure nobody could tell. She drove a leased SUV she couldn't quite afford and talked about Paige's wedding from the moment the engagement was announced like it was the single event that would finally prove the family had arrived somewhere. 80 guests became 120. A backyard ceremony became a barn rental with a stone patio and a band. I heard the numbers secondhand. The way you hear most things in a family that stopped including you in its real conversations, and even secondhand. They didn't sound like numbers a struggling auto shop could carry without bleeding from somewhere else. I didn't put it together yet. Not fully. Not in June when I asked my father about the cedar box in his garage. I only knew that something in his voice that day had the same careful flatness he used whenever a customer asked him a question about money he didn't want to answer honestly. I'd heard that voice my whole life. I just hadn't yet learned to recognize it pointed at me. Paige got engaged this spring after my grandmother died, to a man named Connor Boyd, who sold commercial insurance and wore his good watch even to breakfast. The wedding was planned for October, 16 months after the funeral, and from the moment the engagement was announced, Renata talked about almost nothing else. I asked my father about the jewelry in June, 4 months after the funeral. Standing in his garage while he organized boxes he said he'd brought back from Grandma's house. I asked him plainly, "Where's the cedar box, Dad? The sapphire, the pearls, the brooch?" He didn't look up from the box he was taping shut. "Gone, I think," he said. "Lost in the move, maybe. Or your grandmother gave it to one of the home health aides near the end. You know how she got, those last months. Confused about who was who." I let it sit. I didn't argue, because arguing with my father has never produced anything but a longer silence afterward, and because I had no proof yet that he was lying, only a feeling, low and persistent, like a draft coming from somewhere I couldn't find. I should have trusted the draft sooner. I am a professional at trusting drafts. I just didn't want to believe my own father was the wall letting it in. The house on Birch Lane sat empty that whole summer, waiting on a buyer, and I drove past it more than once without stopping. The way you drive past a place that still hurts to look at directly. In July, I finally let myself pull into the driveway. The real estate agent had left a lockbox on the door, and my father, when I asked, gave me the code without much thought. The way you hand someone a key to a room you've already emptied of anything worth taking. The house was bare. The furniture had been sold off or donated months earlier. I walked through the rooms anyway, my footsteps loud on the bare floors, and stood for a long time in the bedroom where the cedar box used to sit on top of her dresser, a small rectangular shadow still faintly visible in the dust where it had rested for years undisturbed. I was standing in the driveway afterward, locking the door behind me, when Mr. Aldous Penny, who'd lived next door to my grandmother for nearly 30 years, came out to get his mail and saw me there. He was 70-some, the kind of neighbor who notices things from his porch and remembers them accurately. A habit Grandma Astrid always said made him either the best or the worst person on the street, depending on what you were trying to hide. "Haven't seen you out here in a while," he said, leaning against his own mailbox post. "Your dad and that Renata cleared the place out pretty quick after the funeral. Surprised me, honestly. Your grandmother had some nice things. Did you see them moving anything out?" I asked, careful to keep my voice light. "Couple truckloads in March, mostly furniture and boxes," he said. "But I remember your dad coming back alone one afternoon, maybe a week after that. Just him. No truck. Sat in his car out front for a long while before he came in. Came out maybe 20 minutes later with something small under his arm, like a little box. Didn't think much of it at the time. Figured it was something personal he didn't want help carrying. I thanked him and didn't say anything more, because I didn't yet have anything more to say that wouldn't sound like an accusation I couldn't back up. But I drove home that evening with Mr. Penny's 20 minutes sitting heavy in my chest. A detail too specific to be nothing, too small to be proof. Exactly the kind of loose thread I have spent my whole career learning to pull. The bridal shower was in August at Renata's house. String lights over the back patio. A table of gifts wrapped in pale blue paper. I came because Paige asked me herself, and because some part of me still wanted to believe we could be a family that showed up for each other, even an imperfect one. I brought a gift. I wore a dress I liked. I told myself I was fine. Then Paige held up her hand to show the other women a vintage piece Gerald found for me, and the whole patio made a soft, appreciative sound. The kind women make over old things they assume have no history attached to anyone living. I watched the star move in the stone. I watched my father, 3 feet away, smiling the way a man smiles when he thinks no one in the yard knows what he's actually done. "It's beautiful," I said, because I didn't trust my voice for anything longer. Renata beamed at me like I'd passed a test. "Isn't it stunning? Gerald has such an eye. He found it at an estate sale. Can you believe that? Paige is going to wear it down the aisle instead of buying something new. Such a sweet, sentimental gesture. An estate sale. That was the story. Not Grandma's ring. Not theft. A sweet, sentimental gesture, performed with stolen sentiment that wasn't his to spend." I smiled and said something forgettable and went home and sat in my car in my own driveway for 11 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to be honest about what I felt that night, because this isn't a story about a woman who was simply angry. I was angry, but underneath it was something colder and more familiar. I am used to being the person who notices the thing nobody else is willing to see. I have built a career on it. What I wasn't used to was the thing being my own grandmother's hands on my own stepsister's finger, while my own father smiled like a man who'd gotten away with something clean. I didn't accuse anyone that night. A bookkeeper doesn't argue with a feeling. An appraiser doesn't argue with a hunch either. We go and find the paper. The next morning, before work, I opened the file cabinet in my home office and pulled the folder I'd labeled simply asterisk 4 years earlier, when I still thought the only reason I'd ever need it was sentiment. Inside was the scanned copy of Otto Pruitt's 1958 receipt, the one my grandmother had pressed into my hands at her kitchen table. Weight, purity, hallmark, sale price. His signature in fountain pen gone slightly brown with age. Behind it, my own independent appraisal from 4 years before, with updated photographs of the ring, the pearls, and the brooch, each one photographed against a gray card the way I photograph every piece I value professionally. Close-ups of the chip on the shoulder of the setting. A macro shot of the hallmark stamped inside the band. 3 letters and a year. Sharp enough to read under magnification without a loop. I laid the photographs side by side on my desk and looked at them for a long time. This was not a feeling anymore. This was documentation. And documentation, I have learned, does not care how a family wants to be remembered. I didn't call my father. I didn't call Renata. I didn't call Paige. I went to work instead, because tax season for jewelers is summer and fall, when estates settle and insurance renewals come due. And because the calmest thing I have ever learned to do with rage is turn it into a checklist. The first item on the checklist was simple. Where had the ring actually come from, if not an estate sale, and if not my father's imagination? Estate jewelry doesn't move invisibly in a town the size of Asher Hollow. It moves through 3, maybe 4 dealers, all of whom I know professionally, because I am the person they call when they need a second opinion on a stone before they write a check. I started with the most likely one first. A shop 2 towns over called Holt's Heirlooms, run by a woman named Carla Holt, who I'd worked with on insurance claims for 9 years and trusted the way you trust someone who has never once tried to talk a number up in front of a client. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon, told her I was doing some research on a family piece, and asked, carefully, whether a star sapphire ring matching a description I gave her, 1950s setting, small chip on the left shoulder, had passed through her shop in the last year. There was a pause on the line, the kind that tells you the person on the other end is deciding how much to say. I bought a sapphire like that back in February, Carla said finally. Sold it again about 6 weeks ago. Why? February. 3 months after my grandmother's funeral. My stomach went still and cold in a way that had nothing to do with surprise, because some part of me had already known, and the rest of me had simply been waiting for the paper to catch up to the knowing. Who sold it to you, Carla? Another pause. Nora, I don't usually give out seller information. I understand, I said, but I think it's a piece that belonged to my grandmother. I have the original receipt from 1958 and an independent appraisal I had done myself 4 years ago, photographs included. If you bought it in good faith, I'm not coming after you. I just need to know who sold it to you, and I need to see your transaction record. She was quiet for a moment longer. Then she said the thing that turned a draft into a doorway. Come in tomorrow. Bring your paperwork. I almost talked myself out of it twice that night. I sat at my kitchen table with the folder open in front of me, the receipt, the photographs, the small chipped shoulder of the setting captured in close-up under a gray card, and I told myself, more than once, that I was building a case against a man I still half hoped would have an explanation that made all of this unnecessary. Maybe Carla's ring was a different sapphire entirely. Maybe the hallmark was a common stamp from the era, used by a dozen jewelers, not unique to Otto Pruitt's workshop at all. I have built my career on not assuming. I owed my father the same caution, even then, even with the draft already roaring under the door. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about my grandmother's kitchen table, the cold tea, the cedar box, the way she said people forget things. Paper doesn't, like she already knew, somehow, that someone in this family would need reminding. Holt's Heirlooms sits on a quiet street with a green awning and a bell over the door that still rings the old-fashioned way. on a coiled spring instead of an electric chime. Carla met me at the counter with a folder of her own, the kind of folder a careful dealer keeps on every transaction: photographs, intake forms, a copy of the seller's identification. I laid my folder down first. The 1958 receipt, the photographs from my independent appraisal, the hallmark, the chip on the shoulder, the weight recorded to the hundredth of a carat. Carla studied them without speaking, the way professionals study things, slowly, methodically, comparing details instead of reacting to them. Then she turned her own folder around and slid it across the counter toward me. The intake form was dated February the 11th. The item description matched mine almost exactly. A star sapphire ring, 1950s mounting, minor wear to the left shoulder of the setting. The photographs Carla had taken at intake showed the same hallmark I had photographed 4 years earlier. The same three letters. The same year, stamped into the same worn gold. The seller's name on the form was Gerald Lindqvist. My father's signature, his driver's license copied beneath it. His own handwriting filling in the description box with the words, family heirloom, no sentimental attachment, selling to cover medical expenses. Medical expenses. My grandmother had been dead for 3 months by the time he wrote that sentence. There were no medical expenses left to cover. There was only a wedding 16 months away and a stepdaughter he wanted, very badly, to make happy in front of a town that was watching. Carla watched my face while I read it. I paid him $800 for the set, she said quietly. Ring, the pearls, and a small gold brooch. I knew it was undervalued the moment I saw it, but he was insistent on a quick sale, and I had no reason at the time to think it wasn't his to sell. What happened to the pearls and the brooch? Sold the pearls to a private collector in March. Kept the brooch in inventory until last month. Then a young man came in looking for an anniversary gift and bought it for his wife. She paused. The ring I sold back in June. To who? Carla turned the page. The second transaction, dated 6 weeks before the bridal shower, listed the buyer as Gerald Lindqvist. He had sold his own mother's ring to a stranger's shop for $800 in February and bought it back from that same shop in June for $1,100, a $300 markup he paid willingly, in cash. To give it to Paige as a gesture everyone at that bridal shower had called sweet. I sat with that for longer than I'm proud of. Not the theft. I had already absorbed the theft. It was the second transaction that hollowed something out in me. The deliberate, paid-for choice to retrieve the exact ring, my grandmother's ring, and place it on someone else's hand, knowing full well whose hand it was supposed to find. He hadn't forgotten where it came from. He had gone back for it. Carla made me copies of both intake forms, both photograph sets, and a signed statement confirming the transactions and the seller's identity, because she said, plainly, that she didn't like being used to launder a family's dishonesty, even unknowingly. I thanked her. I meant it more than the words could carry. I drove home with the folder on the passenger seat, heavier now, 3 documents thicker than it had been that morning. A receipt from 1958, an appraisal from 4 years ago, a pawn intake form with my father's signature on it twice, 6 weeks apart, telling 2 different lies to 2 different rooms. I want to explain something about what I did next, because I think people expect rage to be loud, and mine has never worked that way. I have spent 12 years learning that the angriest, most effective thing a person holding the truth can do is wait until the lie is standing in a room full of witnesses, and then simply set the paper down. I didn't call my father. I didn't confront Renata. I didn't say a single word to Paige about what I'd found. I made an appointment instead with a family law attorney named Priya Anand, a woman I'd worked with twice before on contested estate appraisals. I laid the whole folder out for her the way I'd laid it out for Carla, and she went through it page by page with the same slow, careful attention. Your grandmother's verbal gift, paired with the original receipt establishing provenance, and the independent appraisal documenting her clear intent to transfer the items to you specifically, gives you a strong claim, Priya said. It's not a formal bequest in a will, but combined with witnesses who can confirm her stated intent. And now this paper trail showing your father sold property that wasn't his to sell. You have what's called a conversion claim. He took something that belonged to you and disposed of it for his own benefit. What does that actually get me? Restitution. The value of the ring, at minimum. Potentially the full set, if we can establish the pearls and the brooch the same way. She looked up at me. But Nora, I want to ask you something before we talk about filing anything. What do you actually want here? The money? The ring itself? Or do you want your family to know, in a room, what he did? I thought about my grandmother's kitchen table. The cold tea. Keep this, people forget things, paper doesn't. I thought about the way she pinned that little gold wren over her heart every year on the anniversary of losing the man who bought her the sapphire, and the way my father had taken all three pieces of that quiet devotion and turned them into a down payment on being liked. I want it where everyone can see it, I said. I want him to have to explain it standing up. Priya nodded slowly, like she'd expected that answer and respected it. Then we don't file first. We document everything cleanly. We prepare a formal demand letter ready to send, and we let you choose your moment. Courts don't care about audiences. Families do. I left her office with a plan and a folder that now had a tab in it, neat and precise, the way I keep everything. Evidence, provenance, transaction, demand. The wedding was 8 weeks away. I went back to work. I appraised 3 estate collections, renewed a dozen insurance policies, attended a Sunday dinner at my father's house in September, and watched him pass the green beans like a man with nothing on his conscience. And I said nothing, because the paper was already saying everything that needed saying. It was simply waiting for the right room. Renata called me in late September, her voice bright in the particular way it gets when she wants something arranged exactly her way. Nora, we'd love for you to do a small toast at the reception. Paige adores you. It would mean so much to your father. I said yes. I meant it differently than she heard it. The wedding was held at the Ashworth Barn, a renovated event space 20 minutes outside town with exposed beams and string lights, and a stone patio for the reception dinner. 200 guests, most of them people who had known my grandmother, people from her church, women who'd bought their first engagement rings from her counter at Hartwell's 30 years earlier, men who still called her Miss Astrid out of old habit. My father had invited half the town. He always did love an audience. I arrived in a navy dress, simple, nothing that asked for attention, with a flat leather portfolio tucked under my arm that I told the coat check girl I needed to keep with me. Inside it were 5 documents in a clear order. The 1958 receipt, the independent appraisal photographs, Carla's signed statement, both intake forms with my father's signature. The demand letter Priya had drafted and dated, ready, unsent, a formality now more than a threat. I sat through the ceremony. Paige walked down the aisle in a long ivory gown, the sapphire catching the light off the barn's open doors exactly the way it always had under my grandmother's reading lamp. And I felt the old grief move through me clean and sharp, grief for a woman who would never have let this happen if she'd known, grief for the version of my father who used to be someone I trusted without checking. The reception moved through dinner the way receptions do, plates cleared, the band tuning, the room loosening into the part of the evening where people start tapping glasses for toasts. Connor's best man went first, easy and funny, the kind of toast that gets a room laughing. Then Renata stood, her own glass raised, and began to speak. She talked about family, about blending 2 households into one, about how grateful she was that Gerald had welcomed Paige as his own from the very first day. And then she got to the part one had been waiting for without quite admitting I was waiting. And I have to say, Renata said, her voice carrying easily across the patio. Gerald gave Paige the most extraordinary gift for this wedding. A truly stunning vintage sapphire, found at an estate sale, restored, and given with so much love. It's not every father who would go to such lengths for a daughter who isn't even his by blood. That's the kind of generosity this family is built on. 200 glasses lifted. My father stood beside Renata, smiling the smile he'd worn his whole life when a room was watching him be admired. And for 1 second, just one, his eyes found mine across the patio, and something in them flickered, because he knew, in that instant, exactly what I had been holding for 8 weeks. I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I have never needed to. Before everyone drinks to that, I said, I'd like to say something. Since it concerns the ring. The room turned the way rooms turn when something shifts beneath the surface of an evening that was supposed to stay pleasant. Renata's smile held, confused, uncertain whether this was still part of the toast. My father's did not hold at all. That ring belonged to my grandmother, Astrid Lindqvist, I said. Many of you knew her. She ran the jewelry counter at Hartwell's for 30 years. She gave that ring to me, specifically, by name, 8 years before she died, along with her pearls and a small gold brooch shaped like a wren. She gave me the original sales receipt from 1958, the year she married my grandfather, the year he bought it for $41 from a jeweler named Otto Pruitt. I had it independently appraised and photographed 4 years ago. I have both documents with me tonight. I opened the portfolio and set the first page on the head table, beside the cake, where the chandelier light could catch it the way it had caught 200 glasses a moment earlier. This is the 1958 receipt, I said. Weight, purity. The hallmark stamped inside the band. This is my own appraisal from 4 years ago. Same hallmark. Same chip on the shoulder of the setting, photographed in detail. I set the second sheet down. A murmur moved through the patio like wind crossing a field. This is an intake form from Holt's Heirlooms in Cedar Bend, dated February the 11th of this year, 3 months after my grandmother's funeral. It lists the seller as Gerald Lindqvist. The item description matches the ring on Paige's hand exactly, hallmark included. The stated reason for sale was, quote, to cover medical expenses. I let that sit for a moment before I set down the third page. This is a second intake form from the same shop, dated 6 weeks before tonight. It shows Gerald Lindqvist purchasing the same ring back for $300 more than he sold it for in cash. The patio had gone completely still. Not quiet. Still, the way a held breath is still. My father stood with his glass in his hand, not drinking, not setting it down, staring at the papers on the table like they might rearrange themselves into something kinder if he looked long enough. I'm not telling anyone what to think about that, I said, my voice level. The voice I use when I'm reading a client through a difficult appraisal, clear and without decoration. I'm telling you what's documented. My grandmother gave this ring to me. My father sold it for $800 3 months after her funeral, and bought it back 6 weeks ago to give to Paige as a wedding gift, and called it generosity in front of 200 people. Paige's hand had gone to her own throat, her eyes moving from the ring on her finger to the papers on the table and back again. The color draining out of her face the way it does when a person realizes, all at once, that the ground they're standing on was never actually solid. I didn't know, Paige said, quiet, almost to herself. Gerald, did you know whose ring this was? My father set his glass down. His hand wasn't quite steady. It was mine to give, he said, but the words came out thin. A man reciting a line he no longer believed himself. She wasn't using it. She's gone. The ring should stay in the family. It was in the family, I said. It was in mine. You took it out of mine and sold it for cash. And the only reason you bought it back was that you got caught feeling sentimental in front of the wrong audience. And you needed something to hand Paige that looked like love. Renata's composure cracked first, not at my father, but at me. How dare you do this here, tonight, of all nights? This is Paige's wedding. I tried to do it quietly months ago, I said. I asked him directly where the jewelry was. He told me it was lost. I have a signed statement from the dealer confirming the sale and the buyback, both under his own name and signature. I didn't bring this here to ruin anything that wasn't already broken before I walked in. Connor's best man set his own glass down slowly, looking between the head table and me. The way a man looks when he realizes the toast he was about to clap for has turned into something else entirely. A few guests near the front had gone very still, their forks resting against their plates. Somewhere toward the back of the patio, someone whispered a question to the person beside them, and the answer traveled outward in a low hum that I could feel more than hear. "This is a misunderstanding," my father said, louder now, reaching for the room the way he always reaches for a room when he feels it slipping. "I gave Astrid's things to my daughter. That's not a crime. That's a father trying to keep something special in the family." "Then why did the form you signed in February say you needed the money for medical expenses 3 months after she was already buried?" I asked, and I kept my voice exactly as level as it had been a moment before. "Because I have learned that the calmer you stay, the louder the lie sounds standing next to you." "And why did you buy it back in cash 6 weeks ago instead of simply telling Paige?" Honestly, where it came from. He didn't have an answer for that. He opened his mouth and nothing came out of it. And the silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. The kind 200 people sitting in folding chairs under string lights understood perfectly well without me saying another word. Hartwell's old jewelry counter had closed years before, but enough of the older guests at that wedding had bought their own first rings from my grandmother to recognize instantly what the papers on that table actually meant. An older woman near the front, Mrs. Kilhoun, who had known Astrid for 40 years, stood up from her chair, slow and certain. "I bought my engagement ring from Astrid Lindqvist in 1979, she said, to no one and everyone. She told me once, sitting at that very counter, that her granddaughter Nora was the only one of you who ever really listened when she talked about her stones. I believe every word this girl just said, because I believe Astrid raised her to tell the truth. And I don't believe Gerald ever learned the same lesson." A few more people murmured agreement, the low, uncomfortable hum of a room recalibrating who it had been applauding a moment before. My father didn't answer Mrs. Calhoun. He didn't answer anyone. He stood at the head table with his jaw working and nothing coming out of it. A man who had spent his whole life being the one who got the final word, standing in a barn full of people who had just watched the final word get taken away from him by his own signature on two pieces of paper, 6 weeks apart. Paige slid the ring off her finger with shaking hands and set it down beside the documents, gently. "The way you set down something you've just learned was never yours to wear." "I'm so sorry," she said to me, and I believed her, because nothing in her face looked like performance. "I didn't know. I would never have worn it if I'd known." "I know," I said. "This was never about you." I gathered the papers back into the portfolio, closed it, and looked at my father one last time across that table. "I'm not going to make a scene out of the rest of tonight," I said. "I came to say what needed saying. The ring is mine. I have the documentation to prove it, and a lawyer ready to file if you'd like to argue otherwise. I'd like it back, along with the value of the pearls and the brooch you also sold. I think you know that's fair." He didn't answer. He sat down, heavily, in a chair that suddenly looked too large for him, and stared at the tablecloth the way a man stares at a verdict he already knows is coming. The band started again, hesitant at first, then steadier. The way a room decides, collectively, that the worst of it has already happened and the night has to keep moving forward whether anyone's ready or not. I didn't stay much longer. I hugged Paige, who was crying quietly into a cocktail napkin, and told her none of this was hers to carry. I did not hug my father. I did not hug Renata. I walked out through the barn's wide doors into the cool October air, the portfolio under my arm, lighter somehow than it had been all evening, even though the papers inside it weighed exactly the same. The weeks afterward moved the way consequences usually do, quietly, then all at once. My father called Priya's office within 4 days, through his own attorney, agreeing to a settlement before any filing became necessary. He paid the appraised value of all three pieces, the sapphire, the pearls, and the brooch, into an account in my name, along with a written acknowledgement, drafted by lawyers on both sides, that the items had been gifted to me by Astrid Lindqvist prior to her death and improperly sold without my knowledge or consent. Carla Holt sold me back the sapphire ring at her cost, no markup, the same week. She said she didn't feel right keeping a profit on something that should never have crossed her counter in the first place. I drove to Cedar Bend on a Tuesday afternoon and watched her slide the small box across the counter to me. And I sat in my car in her parking lot for a long time afterward with the ring in my palm, turning it under the light, watching the star move the way it had moved on my grandmother's hand for 66 years. The pearls were harder. The private collector who'd bought them agreed, eventually, to sell them back at a fair price once Carla explained the circumstances, though it took 2 more months and a conversation I didn't have to be part of. The brooch I never recovered. The young man who'd bought it for his wife's anniversary had already given it to her, and I couldn't bring myself to ask a stranger to give up a gift bought in good faith just to close a wound that wasn't hers to carry. I let it go. Some accounts don't fully reconcile, and a person learns, eventually, which ones are worth the rest of their peace and which ones aren't. My father and I haven't had a real conversation since the wedding. He sent a card at Christmas, 4 lines, formal, the kind of card you send to someone you're not yet ready to face directly. I read it once and put it in the same drawer where I keep the appraisal photographs and the 1958 receipt, because some things need time before you're ready to read them again, and I'm not ready yet. I might never fully be, and I've stopped treating that as a problem I owe anyone an apology for. Lindqvist Auto closed its doors in January, the loan against the building finally catching up with a debt that no amount of borrowed jewelry money had ever been enough to outrun. I heard about it from a cousin, not from my father directly, the way I hear most things about him now. I felt less satisfaction in that than I expected to. Mostly, I felt the particular flatness of watching a slow collapse you predicted months earlier and never wanted to be right about. Renata stopped speaking to me entirely. Paige and I talk more now than we ever did before that wedding, oddly enough. Two women who finally found something honest to say to each other once the performance fell away. She called me in November, a month after the wedding, and asked if we could get coffee, just the two of us, away from both houses and both mothers. We sat in a booth at a diner on Cobb Street for 2 hours, and she told me things she'd never said to anyone in that family. About feeling like a piece moved around a board her whole childhood. About how exhausting it is to be the daughter everyone performs generosity toward instead of the daughter people simply love without an audience watching. I understood that better than she probably realized. She wears a different ring now. One Connor picked out himself, nothing inherited. Nothing borrowed from a grief that wasn't his to spend. I drove out to Holt's Heirlooms again in late November, this time just to thank Carla properly, with a bottle of wine and no folder under my arm. She told me, almost offhand, that she'd started asking sellers more questions since February, where a piece had come from, whether anyone else in the family knew it was being sold. Small things. The kind of friction that slows a dishonest transaction down just enough for someone like me to catch it before it disappears for good. I didn't ask her to start doing that. She just had, because the story had stayed with her the way it stays with anyone who handles other people's history for a living. I wear my grandmother's sapphire on my right hand, not my left, because I've never wanted it to be mistaken for anyone's promise but hers. The pearls sit in a small box on my dresser now, restrung by a jeweler in Cedar Bend who matched the original nodding technique from a photograph in my own appraisal file. I never recovered the brooch, and some evenings that still sits in me like an unfinished sentence. A small gold red pin to a stranger's collar somewhere I'll never see it. I've made my peace with it the way I've made my peace with most of what this year cost me. Not every account fully reconciles. A person learns, eventually, which balances are worth carrying forward and which ones are simply the price of having told the truth out loud. Some evenings, I sit on my own porch with a cup of tea going cold, the way she used to, and I turn the ring under the last of the light and think about the kitchen table where she handed me a $41 receipt and told me, plainly, that people forget things, but paper doesn't. She was right about that. She was right about almost everything, including the part she never said out loud, that a person doesn't have to shout to be believed. She just has to be the one still holding the proof when everyone else has run out of explanations. I started keeping a second cedar box this year, smaller than hers, on my own dresser. Inside it, alongside the sapphire and the restrung pearls, I keep a copy of every document from that folder. The 1958 receipt, my own appraisal, Carla's signed statement, both intake forms with my father's signature 6 weeks apart. Not because I need them anymore. The settlement is signed, the matter is closed, and nobody is left to argue otherwise. I keep them the way my grandmother kept her own proof, quietly, patiently, in case anyone in this family ever needs reminding again of what actually happened, and who actually told the truth when it would have been so much easier not to. I am the one who notices what other people overlook. That used to feel like a lonely thing to be. Now it feels like exactly what she raised me to become. And for the first time since the funeral, that feels like enough.